vertical edge of the rabbet. In this way, as well as in their general appearance, the unfenced rabbet plane is similar to the modern iron shoulder plane. However, where the shoulder plane has a low bed angle and a bevel-up iron, the unfenced wooden rabbet plane typically has a bed angle of 45 to 55 degrees and a bevel-down iron. Unfenced rabbet planes were historically available in versions with a straight iron and versions with a skewed iron. Today, the skewed iron version is the more commonly found of the two. The skewed iron makes these planes handle cuts against or across the grain of a board better than their straight iron siblings. However, the skewed iron consequently makes the plane more difficult to use to create or sink a rabbet by using the fingers as a fence, because it tends to pull the plane into the board. Therefore, if the desire is to use an unfenced rabbet plane to sink a rabbet using the fingers as a fence against the recommendation of Mr. Nicholson, the square rabbet is the better tool. Because these are such simple tools, there really is very little that can go wrong with them. When shopping for an unfenced rabbet plane, be sure that the iron is solid and free from deep pitting on the face or flat side. Check the mouth to make sure that it isn't too wide, but don't be overly concerned about this because the plane surface is on the inside of a joint, so minor tear out won't be seen. Make sure the wedge fits the plane properly and holds the iron securely, unless you're comfortable adjusting or replacing the wedge yourself. Finally, make sure the body isn't significantly bowed from side to side. Today, I'm going to use this 5/8 inch square rabbet plane to demonstrate how to assess and tune up an unfenced rabbet plane. The process for assessing and tuning an unfenced rabbet plane with a skewed iron is identical. Begin by assessing the straightness of the body. You should have done this before purchasing the plane, because a severely warped plane body is really unusable. Very minor warp can be dealt with either by planing the body slightly narrower or simply by tolerating the slight bow in the body. I've chosen to make this plane slightly narrower since the bow is minor enough that it can be planed out rather easily. In addition, the body of this plane has a little bit of twist, and planing it slightly narrower will remove this twist during the process. To keep the body from flexing while it's being planed, slip sheets of paper under the concave side to support the body. Using standard technique for flattening the face of a board, plane the side of the body until it's flat, checking frequently with winding sticks to avoid introducing twist. Take very light shavings to avoid removing too much wood. When the first side is flat, use a marking gauge to mark an even thickness around the body and plane the bow out of the opposite side. Do your best to take a fairly even amount of wood off of each side of the plane body in order to keep the wedge mortise centered on the stock. With the body flattened, I like to work on the wedge next. If the wedge is easy to remove and insert and holds the blade firmly in place, I won't do much more than clean it up and maybe smooth off any chips or hammer marks in the finial. If the wedge is a bit tight like this one, however, I'll plane or scrape a small amount from the tight spots to make it fit better. If the blade isn't held firmly right up to the tip of the wedge, then I'll plane the wedge lightly to alter its angle and remove any humps until it fits the wedge mortise properly and holds the iron firmly in place. Clamping a bench plane upside down in the vise and moving the wedge over it allows me to remove wood only from the spots where I need to and gives me a lot of control over the process. Just watch your fingers if you decide to use this method. Once the wedge fits well, the sole of the plane can be trued. The sole should be flat from heel to toe and relatively square to the sides of the plane. The sole can be trued by lapping on 220 grit sandpaper adhered to a flat substrate, or it can simply be planed with another plane until it's straight and square to the sides. After the sole's been trued, turn your attention to the iron. The iron needs to be ground and honed so that the edge is flat and parallel to the sole of the plane. Color the face of the iron with the machinist layout fluid or a permanent magic marker. Put the iron into the plane and wedge it firmly in place. Make sure the iron protrudes below the sole of the plane across its entire width. Also, make sure the sides of the iron protrude past both sides of the plane slightly. This will be important when we're doing the final setup later. Using an awl or machinist scribe, transfer the profile of the sole to the face of the iron. And while you're at it, scribe the sides of the iron to the width of the plane body as well. Remove the iron from the plane and blunt grind the edge of the iron to the scribe line by grinding at 90 degrees to the wheel. Because I made the body of this plane narrower, it's necessary for me to grind the iron narrower as well. Even if your plane hasn't been narrowed, it may be necessary to complete this step with your plane if the iron protrudes too far from the side of the plane body because the body has shrunk over time. Grind the sides of the iron down until they're within a 32nd of an inch or so from the line. Finally, using the grinder, establish the primary bevel. Since I don't use secondary bevels, I grind the bevel at about 30 degrees. The last step is to hone using your favorite method. To set the plane up, insert the iron back into the plane and wedge it in place with hand pressure. To align the iron, I begin by placing it on its side on the workbench with a sheet of copy paper under the area just in front of and just behind the mouth. Make sure the iron isn't resting on the paper. Press the iron down so that its side contacts the bench top. Doing this ensures that the side of the iron protrudes ever so slightly from the side of the plane. This is necessary for a rabbet plane to function properly. Adjust the depth of cut by tapping very lightly on the heel of the plane or the top of the iron's tang. Place the plane back onto the paper and realign the iron. Then give the wedge a tap to set it firmly. A properly set rabbet plane should have the edge of the iron parallel to the sole of the plane, and the side of the iron should also sit slightly proud of the side of the plane. This is necessary for proper function. To use an unfenced rabbet plane to sink a rabbet, first scribe the width of the rabbet with a marking gauge. Then wrap the fingers of the leading hand around the underside of the plane and grip the plane firmly with the pads of the fingers. The fingertips will act as a fence to keep the rabbet plane a consistent distance from the edge of the board. Place the palm of the rear hand over the top of the heel of the plane. This hand provides the force while the leading hand keeps the plane steady. Sinking a rabbet with an unfenced plane takes a bit of practice, but it can be done. Angling the plane slightly and placing the corner of the iron in the scribe line made by the marking gauge can be a helpful technique for starting the plane on a straight path. The plane is then gradually leveled as the rabbet is made deeper. With a square rabbet plane and well-behaved wood, however, the plane can often be started flat. Once the rabbet is sunk, either with the unfenced rabbet plane or with a fenced rabbet plane, fencing the plane with the fingers becomes unnecessary. The bottom may be trimmed and deepened by riding the plane against the vertical wall of the rabbet. To trim the vertical wall of the rabbet, lay the plane down on its right side on the bottom of the rabbet. For the most precise results, use a marking gauge to first define the width and depth of the rabbet on the adjacent face and edge of the board. Then, sink the rabbet slightly shy of the gauge lines and alternately adjust the depth and width until both gauge lines just disappear. At this point, the plane is really finished. However, I chose to add some decorative chamfers to the plane body, typical of earlier planes, making the plane more comfortable in use and more aesthetically pleasing. This is an optional step, but since this particular plane is not a rare make or style, I don't feel bad about altering it and doing what's necessary to make it a usable tool once again. Really don't want to do this to a rare plane, but this isn't one of those cases, so I'll clean it up, add a little bit of finish, and then call it done. So for just a few dollars and about an hour of work, we've taken a plane that was barely worth the materials it was made from and turned it back into a beautiful tool that works just as well as it looks.